Parrot TV, the voice for humanity.
Welcome to the New York Parrot Literary Corner. I am your host, Dustin Pickering, and today we have Darlene Campos, who has been writing since she was about 10 years old. Her first publication appeared in an anthology called A Celebration of Young Poets in 2002. When she was a kid, she traveled widely, often to Germany, and seeing the world inspired her to create stories. She graduated from Stratford High School in Houston, Texas, a year early. Then she attended Houston Community College and the University of Houston, where she worked as a writer and editor for the student publication department for 4 years. Campos majored in English with a creative writing concentration and minored in medical studies, which is why her works often contain medical themes. She attended grad school at the University of Texas at El Paso, where she earned a MFA in creative writing. However, she is still studying Hebrew, Yiddish, world religions, Jewish theology, Christian theology, and will start a German language course later this year. She works in higher education as an English tutor and test preparation instructor. When she is not working or studying, she's usually writing or taking care of her 5 cats. She is currently represented by Allison Hellingers of Stamola Literary Studio. She was previously a young adult and middle grade author with Vital Narrative Press, a small publishing house based in Memphis, Tennessee. Her work has won awards like the Dustin Award for Fiction, the Sylvan N. Carpenter Prize, and the Glass Mountain Magazine for Best Prose Award. She's also a 2-time finalist for Best of the Net and fiction and nonfiction categories and has appeared in the fall 2020 issue of Poets and Writers magazine. Thanks for joining us today, Darlene. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Not bad. I just, daily stuff, So if there's anything that's not in your bio that you'd like to say about yourself, feel free.
Can't think of anything. I think that just about covers it.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So, my first question, how how did your imagination as a child, work towards becoming creative writer? I mean, what inspired that?
I think traveling a lot had a lot to do with it because I went pretty much all over Europe. I went to Germany, England, France, Italy, Poland, a little bit of the Czech Republic, and just seeing all these different sites that look a lot different than where I live, which is in Houston, Texas.
Hmm.
It gives you all sorts of ideas. Like, for example, in Europe, if you just drive in the countryside, you'll come across a castle. But in Texas, it's, interesting sites, but it's mostly gas stations and fields and
Right.
restaurants. So it was just a really different landscape. So then seeing all these different settings really gave me a lot of ideas. And then that's pretty much how I started creating stories.
That's interesting. So you kind of like the shift from one landscape to another sort of stimulated your imagination into thinking a little maybe outside your usual box. And you would you create stories about the places you saw, or would you just create stories in general, or how did that work?
I'm pretty sure I did. I do remember writing a story when I was in 4th grade about a prisoner who escaped from the Tower of London.
Hmm.
I don't know if I still have it on me or not, but I do remember that I had a lot of fun with that. And I probably created more, but it's been about 20 years now, so I can't remember any more
Interesting.
than that.
Yeah, you can't always keep track of everything you write, right? I mean,
Yeah,
sometimes. I mean, even to me, I write so much that I just don't have the capacity to keep everything in tow. And I don't have a record of everything. So
exactly.
medical themes find their way into your writing these days. So how does that work? What kind of themes do you explore?
Yeah, so my dad is a doctor
Hmm.
and he hasn't retired. He's still going and probably will always go until the day before he dies.
Hmm.
So I grew up in and out of hospitals, not because I was sick, but because my mom would take me to go visit him, for example. And we would probably have lunch with him or maybe some coffee and a pastry. So he was always in a hospital. And that's where I always saw him. And since I went there so often, it became a really major part of my childhood. And so pretty much everything I write, I would say maybe 95%, there's either a doctor or someone goes to the hospital or somebody gets sick or someone needs some kind of physical therapy or something. And that really has a lot to do with my childhood growing up in and out of hospitals.
Interesting. So that kind of factors into your work, you know, like as you say, you use characters that are doctors and people that are patients. So you also study religion, world religion, as well as, you know, languages. Do you do any translation?
I can do translation work from English to Spanish, but not more than that. Spanish and English are my strongest languages.
Okay.
The other languages that I've been learning, I have an elementary level so far, but who knows, maybe 5 years from now, I could do translation work in Hebrew or Yiddish or even German. We'll just have to wait and see.
How long do you think it takes roughly to, I don't want to say master a language, but have enough of a grasp that you could work around a translation? Do you have any idea, like how many years you think it would take to accomplish that, to get to that level of understanding the language?
Just understand basic terms such as how are you doing or what did you do over the weekend, things like that. I'd say it only takes about 3 months. But to get into really in-depth conversations, I would say anywhere from a year to 2 years. Because the other thing about languages is that you have to practice them. Otherwise,
Right.
you'll lose all your vocabulary.
True. Do you have you translated from Spanish and English across those languages, or have you not?
I have. I did some translation work right when the pandemic started last year. So that kept me busy for a couple of weeks. I translated an anthology of poetry for Vital Narrative Press. And that was a lot of fun. But the other thing too about translation is that there's always something you can say in one language that you can't really say in another language.
Right.
And that's where it can get kind of difficult, and you have to stop and think, okay, like if I say this in English, it doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense in Spanish, but how do I make this term or phrase make sense? So that's where it gets very tricky.
Right, it's because there's certain colloquialisms and things that aren't shared across languages that you find and you know, when you're translating, it's like, oh, well, this is a little tricky here.
Exactly. Like I remember a few years ago, my sister-in-law, who was from, I think she's from Michigan or so, she said, I'm gonna go to the carryout. Do you want anything? And I had no idea what she was talking about. And she was talking about the convenience store. But in Texas, we would probably just say, I'm going to the corner store, or I'm going to the gas station or something like that.
Right.
But that, and I was like, what the heck is she talking about? So even in the same language, there's different ways of saying.
Right. So, and also in your studies of religion, did those themes ever find themselves, you know, that you're learning from those disciplines? Did they ever work their way into your writing at all?
They certainly do, in a way. I am not the type of person who likes to, say, preach at people.
Right.
So I will incorporate religious views into my work, but they're a part of the character. They're not meant to, I'm not looking to convert people or something like that. Like I just to
add depth to the conversations and characters. You know, you want to characterize them as some kind of person. And so do you ever find like you like to kind of play with ideas in your work like that? Like, you know, use the characters as kind of conveying certain ideas or?
Oh, for sure. For example, in my second novel called Summer Camp is Canceled, my main character is Catholic. So there are certain actions that he thinks twice about, because then he thinks, oh wait, like, am I allowed to do that? And it's not that he's being suppressed or anything like that. It's just that he tends to think like, okay, is this okay with my religion? Can I do this certain thing? So for example, he has a crush on a girl who is Baptist, and then he hears from his priest that he cannot even think about dating a girl who's not Catholic. And then he has a long talk with his parents, and they tell him like, no, like, we're personally okay with that. You know, if you like her, and etc. etc. So it, having a religious view does change a person, and also changes the character.
Huh, that's interesting. So you have the conflict based on the faith, and the different institutions and the parents sort of, create this and at least in the story you mentioned, they create a kind of conflict, but ultimately I'm sure the character resolved with the parents and said, okay, well, you're my foundation. So that would be my guess. That would be my guess. So like far as like what are you currently reading that you find interesting?
Right now I'm reading a book called Mercy Suarez Can't Dance. It's by Meg Medina. She's also the author of Mercy Suarez Changes Gears.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I'm reading that is because Mercy's grandfather has Alzheimer's, and my grandmother has Alzheimer's. So I can really connect to the story, because I understand how Mercy is watching her grandfather change. Because Alzheimer's is not, it's not a disease that happens and then all of a sudden it's over. It's a long and slow process, and it's very painful to watch. So I can really relate to Mercy Suarez's stories because of what I'm going through with my grandmother.
Do you think it's a kind of, you're seeking like an understanding of the illness itself through reading some, reading things that are story wise, learning to empathize and through the stories?
I would say so, yes, because it's not really that people don't empathize with certain diseases, like say Alzheimer's. It's more of educating yourself.
Right.
Like with my grandmother, it was small. It started with very small actions that she couldn't do anymore. Like she forgot how to use a washing machine, so she forgot how to do her laundry. And I could show her, my grandfather could show her, another family member. We would, teach her how to use the washing machine, and then she would remember, and she would say like, oh, like, of course, it's so easy. But then by the next day she would forget. And then now she has very, very limited speech. She can't walk anymore, but it took around 5 years to get to this point.
Mm-hmm.
So I think having stories, such as the Mercy Suarez series, really helps people understand that Alzheimer's is a very, very long and slow process, and stories with any kind of medical condition present really do help people understand just what happens when they appear in a person.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think when you're reading a story about a person, you learn to understand what's going on, and you can get information from stories that a lot of times like maybe a scientific journal may be above someone's grade, or it may be not as interesting to somebody as reading an actual story of something taking place in a person's life. And it's more relatable, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So do you have a sample of your work you'd like to share?
Not on me. No, I don't. I didn't
Oh,
know
I
that.
should have mentioned that before. If you had something like a poem or a few paragraphs of a story. Okay, well, we'll just move on from here, and just keep the questions coming.
Sure.
So, what you also teach. You're also an instructor. What do you feel? Do you learn in teaching? Do you also get reciprocated back? In your students, that is there any interesting stories that you like to share as far as something you realized from teaching?
Oh, definitely, all the time. So I've been in the education field for about 7.5 years. And the students that I get are from all different walks of life. Some of them are right out of high school. Some of them they probably started college when they were young and life kind of got in the way, so they're coming back after being out of school for about 20 years. I've had students who are veterans from the Vietnam War.
Hmm.
So I have a really wide range of students and where they come from. And the interesting thing is that they often think, oh, writing is so hard and I can't do it because I'm not an English major. Or they might think that they don't have anything interesting to say. But I have not had even one student who didn't have a story to tell. And every single time they they write so beautifully. I remember I had one student who wrote an essay about his best friend who committed suicide.
Mhm.
And then at the end of his essay, he wrote a poem to his friend, and it was just one of the most amazing things I had ever read. And I immediately told him, you have to send this into literary journals and magazines and see if you get a home for this. So I think it's more of, they think that they can't write because they're not an English major, but I think it's also they're kind of nervous about sharing their stories.
Hmm.
And they think that maybe the reader isn't going to care or we're not going to be interested, but they're really amazing people. So I really do enjoy the education field.
Right. You bring out people's stories from them and get them, inspired to write. And do you find that is that a difficult process, or is that something that, takes a little time?
It definitely takes a little bit of time. The most common prompt that I give them is, tell me about a time when you learned something new.
Hmm.
And that could be anywhere from, they'll write a story about, this is the time I learned how to ride a bike, or it might even be, this is the time I learned how to drive a car, or I learned that, life isn't always fair, or something like that. So once I give them these small prompts and it gets them thinking, then they can just really get creative and it comes up very, very easily for them.
So I imagine you think, you believe that everyone has the creative spark within them, that they just have to nurture it, and educators, that's part of their job, is to bring that creative spark out.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think everyone has a little creative light in them that they just have to let
Yeah.
it shine. Mhm.
So that's probably, I mean, I would imagine, like you said, it's a time, time consuming, and energy wise, I mean, you must get tired sometimes of writing. And how do you balance the writing with teaching and studying and doing your own reading? I mean, do you have a strict schedule, or do you just kind of flow, or how does that work?
So I try to keep a schedule, but when you work in education, the work can get a little bit hectic.
Hmm.
So sometimes I'll be working until 9, 10 o'clock at night because I just have so much to do. But I do try to keep a schedule. So at the end of my shift every day, I walk anywhere from 3 to 5 miles around my neighborhood, and it helps me decompress and
Hmm.
relax. And it's also, you know, good for me. It's exercise.
Right, of
And
course.
a lot of times during these walks, since I'm, just observing nature, observing the neighborhood, a lot of times I'll get a story idea while I'm walking. And thank goodness for phones, because now we can jot notes on our phone instead of having
Right.
to rush back and find a notebook. So that definitely helps. It's just my walk in the middle of the day really helps me just get into a relaxed state of mind.
I think it was Thoreau who wrote that the best ideas are born from walking. I think it was him. I'm not quite sure about that quote, but I've read something similar to that. So you've also won numerous awards, and maybe you could discuss a little bit about those awards and the process, and how it felt to actually, succeed in that. I mean, that's a quite of an accomplishment.
Oh yeah, definitely. So the most recent award that I won was the Dustin Award
Hmm.
for the best fiction piece, and that was given to me by the Desi Writers Lounge in India. So once a year, they hold this contest where anyone in the world can submit a fictional story, and then it gets judged, and there is one winner of the Dustin Award and I think 2 runner-ups. So for that story in particular, I started writing it shortly before my grandfather died. So what happened was a journal, not the one associated with the Dustin Award, a journal approached me and they said, "We've read some of your work in other journals and we want you to write something for us." And I said, sure, I can definitely do that for you. But I hit this huge writer's block and I had no ideas, couldn't think of any names for the characters. I couldn't think of anything. So I was just really, really struggling with it. And then my grandfather died all of a sudden. He had a heart attack and he was gone within 3 or 4 days. And then when he died, somehow I got a little inspiration. The story is about a child who loses his grandfather all of a sudden. So then I finished the story, I sent it to the magazine, and they didn't accept it. They said, "Oh, it's not quite what we're looking for, but thank you so much." So I felt a little frustrated. I thought, well, I just wasted my time. But I thought, okay, I'll just send this somewhere else. And then one day I was just, browsing through the internet, and I heard about the contest, and I thought, well, why not? Let me just send this in. And then I won. And I was so in shock. And I thought, well, I'm glad that the other magazine didn't take it, because then I wouldn't have been eligible for this contest.
Right.
So yeah, life just worked out in a better way for me. And for that story, I got, I think, $700. So I used it to pay my wedding photographer, because I was engaged at the time. So everything worked out in my favor, and I'm very happy for that.
That's excellent. And you also had a, I don't know if it was a feature or if it was an article in Poets and Writers. How did they approach you, or did you write to them? How did that come about?
Yeah, so a writer for them approached me on Twitter because she was writing an article about online MFA programs. And my MFA program was 100% online. I went to the University of Texas at El Paso in person when I graduated. So I had never seen the campus before. I'd seen photos of it, but I had never been there. I didn't know where anything was. It's a very beautiful campus and a very beautiful scenery. And El Paso is a very, very beautiful city. But I loved going to school online because it didn't interfere with my work schedule. So I could work my regular shift, and then I would do my homework either really early in the morning or really late at night. So it just worked out perfectly. So that's what the article was about. So it was 2 other writers, maybe 3 other writers, and myself. And we just talked about, our experiences and the cost and just what overall thoughts about our online MFA programs. So that was a lot of fun.
And what edition of the Poets and Writers was that in, if someone wanted to check it out and see what you had to say?
Yes, it's in the September, October 2020 issue. So it came out about 6 months ago. Excellent.
And then I have a general question. Maybe you could give some more of insight into this. I think I could give my own insight, but this is an interview. So what do you think if are writers lonely people?
I think that they can be, but I don't think it's a requirement. Like I function best with writing when everything is quiet and I can have a few minutes to myself and just really think about what I'm writing. But I've seen writers who love to write at a coffee shop where it's very noisy. And there's people talking and the coffee machine is going and there's all this grinding and the baristas are calling out orders. Some people write best that way. So it just really depends on the person.
It's probably true. I think people are composed differently. Writers can kind of fit into an environment, or they may be sitting at home and reflecting on things and delving into their own emotions and pulling out what they have. So do you feel like, as a person who studied creative writing formally, do you think that is something that helps you develop as a writer, or do you feel like maybe that stifles? Because I've heard some people say, going through the creative writing program, it changed their style, or their, something that they, they didn't feel like they got much out of it. But do you think you got a lot out of it?
Oh yes, I can't imagine where my work would be if I hadn't gone to creative writing programs. First of all, I met a lot of classmates who are now really close friends.
Hmm.
So I developed a lot of close relationships from the program. And then there's a lot that I would say most people wouldn't think about. Like, I remember one thing we discussed was filler words in writing,
Hmm.
like the word that and just or like, and how they make sentences sound a little bit slower. And I probably wouldn't have thought about that at this point in my career. So
Hmm.
I'm very grateful for the experience. And I also think that it even nurtures empathy because we have to read as well. So it's not just writing, it's writing and reading
Right.
constantly. And then when you read all these different stories about events that happen to people, then you start to connect with them and you feel like, oh man, like what an experience. And so I think it's good for the writing technique and it's also good for the soul to study creative writing.
Oh, that's interesting insight. I've just heard some people say that they went through the program or they went through a program and they found that they started off in one format and then they came out as a totally different thing. It kind of manufactured a personal style out of them that they were maybe less comfortable with or less accustomed to. I just wondered, I never studied it formally, so I wondered what insights you had on that. So, is there anything you'd like to tell us about your current projects, working, what your next step is ahead for you as far as your writing work?
Sure. So right now, my biggest project that I've been working on for a couple years now, actually, it's a historical middle grade book. And my agent and I are working on final revisions and then sending that out to publishing houses to see who's interested. But aside from that, because I've been working on that project for a while, and that project took a long time because since it was historical fiction, there was a lot of research involved, and also trying to avoid anachronisms,
Hmm.
things like that. So that's why it took so long to really get it to the right draft. But in addition to that, I've been working on some nonfiction pieces, a couple poems, just kind of playing around. I definitely would not call myself a poet,
Hmm.
but from time to time I do write some poetry. So I've been working on just some, I guess, some memoir pieces, if you want to call them that.
Interesting. So there's sometimes a distinguishing, I mean, yeah, for instance, you have the magazine poets and writers. So,
Right.
and there's like a distinguishing feature between poets and writers in general. Do you think that's an apt, I don't, like an apt distinguishing mark, like a poet is maybe a different type of writer than a writer per se?
Well, I definitely would say that poets are writers because they are
Right.
writing a message or a story. They're just doing it with a poetry formula. But I would say that it's not my strongest writing skill just because I struggle to put a message in a very short amount of words.
Right.
Like I like to have a setup of a setting and characters and plot and all of that, but with poetry, that's a little tougher. Unless you write something like Beowulf, which is an epic.
Right. Right.
But
Of course. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with many people who do epic poetry at this time. I'm sure there are some who do, but
Frederick Glacier, I know he put something out called the Parliament of Poets a few years back, and I had an opportunity to meet him. There are a few epic poets out there. That's interesting. That I just hear that some people say a poet is a sort of a different brand of writer than fiction or nonfiction, and those are more classified kind of in their own right. And then there's the poet that's sort of like, sometimes some people say if you listen to a poet, they'll say it's kind of foundational to the arts. It's like music, and I just wondered what your thoughts on that were. But we have about what's remaining 7 minutes or so. So if you want to impart some kind of final message to the audience and the viewers, feel free to go ahead and, we have a world audience out there that may want to hear what you have to say.
Sure. So when writing a creative piece, and this really goes along with any creative field, it can be art or music, the first draft or the first painting or the first recording is never going to be perfect. I don't think any creative work is ever going to be 100% perfect, but it's completely okay to start out with something that isn't, not to say that it's not good, but it's not to your liking. And then you just have to keep revising, keep painting, keep recording until you get to a point where you feel like, okay, this art is at a point where I think it's satisfactory. So I think of it as like if you play soccer or football like the rest of the world does, you're not always going to score a goal, but you have to keep running and kicking to eventually score a goal. Because if you just stand there, well, nothing's going to happen. So it's the same with any creative process, is that you really have to just keep kicking and keep going until you get to a point where you feel satisfied with your work.
That's excellent advice. You just keep in motion, keep running the thing, keep running the ball. So what are challenges you experienced while learning creative writing, and how did you manage to get through those?
I'd say the biggest challenge is coming up with ideas, because if you don't have an idea, the page just stays blank. But I had one professor who said, just sit down where you are and just write about your environment. And that worked wonders for me. So if you just sit down, even in your own house, and you just say like, oh, my white carpet or my beige walls or something like that, eventually something will come into your brain, and then you'll think, oh, well, maybe I can write a story about that features a white floor or something like that. So that really helped me out. But yeah, getting ideas are sometimes they're not as easy as people think.
Right. Very intimidating to look at the blank space on the screen or on the page. So what are some of the most memorable moments you've had in creative writing classroom, working with others and building your own stories?
Yeah, so I remember when I was at U of H, there was this story that my classmate wrote, and she was a makeup artist for people who had passed away. Sure, there's a technical term for it, but I can't remember exactly what it was. So that was her job, is that she worked at different funeral homes, and she would put makeup on the deceased and make them look the way that they had looked when they were alive. And she wrote this beautiful story about working in that field, and I wish I could remember her name, because I really hope that she published that story. But that was still to this day one of the best stories I ever read. So I really hope that she made it into a book or something like that. And if you're watching, I hope you can message me and tell me your name.
And I think another interesting question would be, do you think that creative writing is inborn in somebody, or do you think that something can spark that imagination? Or we talked earlier in the interview about your moving around and shifting environments and how that affected your imagination to spark that. Do you think there's maybe like an inborn tendency, or if it's something that is sort of like nurtured in some way?
I think some people are definitely born with a creative spark, but they still have to nurture it.
Mm-hmm.
And then other people who might think that they're not creative actually are, but they also have to nurture it as well. So for example, if I were to go to school for plumbing and then I graduate and then I never work in plumbing, I'm probably not going to remember how to fix a pipe 15 years later.
Right.
So it's really just a skill that has to still be sharpened, just like anything else.
I think so too. The more you practice, the better you get, and the more you keep you hone your craft and like you said, you made the analogy to the plumber. I mean, obviously, if you study something and then you move on and you don't go back to it, your memory is going to get kind of weak on it. It's like a muscle,
Oh yeah, definitely.
So, I asked, if there's any one last thing you want to say. We talked about earlier, you mentioned, keep the drafts coming and the so forth. If there's anything else you'd like to add to that to kind of continue that thought, or if you would, if you're content with what's been said.
Sure. So one final piece of advice that I would give is to not listen to all criticism. I'm not saying that criticism doesn't have value to it, but there is definitely a difference between constructive criticism and destructive criticism. And I would say that most people know what the difference is. So the destructive criticism, I would say just throw it out the window. It's not gonna help.
Right. So discern between the bad audience and the good audience that are saying good things that would help hone your craft. And so where can, we'll let you plug your work here. Where can we find your work?
Yeah, so you can find links to all of my books and all of my work at my website. So my website is www.darlenepcampos.com. I also have a blog on there that I update from time to time, and I have a contact form on there as well. So that's where I keep everything.
Excellent. I appreciate your time on the show today, Darlene. And I think we've learned quite a bit about your process and writing in general, and creative writing, and classroom environments and shifting in imagination and so forth. I think that it's been a very productive talk, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really had a lot of fun.
Yeah, you too. And we're doing the 1 million viewer subscriber challenge. So if people viewing us right now, please subscribe to our channel. We are looking for plenty of subscribers. So, and if you know someone, anybody out there listening in, if you want to join us on the program, please be in touch. So thank you very much for your time again.
Thank you so much.